to the Access to Legal Aid Caucus's first briefing for the 117th Congress. I'm Mary Gay Scanlon, Congresswoman for Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District. I'm so happy to be here with my co-chair, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, also from Pennsylvania, our distinguished guests from the Legal Services Corporation, and expert panelists from across the country. As most of you know, the purpose of Access to Legal Aid Caucus is to inform members and their staff about the importance of access to legal services across all sectors of society, whether that means legal representation for veterans, those facing evictions, people struggling with opioid addiction, or survivors trying to escape domestic violence. Legal aid can have a life-changing impact on those of our constituents who need the most help. I'm proud that our caucus has and will continue to tackle those critical issues in a bipartisan way. And we're looking forward to bringing many more informative briefings to the Hill. Now, before coming to Congress just over 2 years ago, I spent over 3 decades working at the intersection of pro bono and legal services work as a volunteer, as a board member, and as an employee, partnering with legal services agencies across the country on a variety of poverty and civil rights issues to expand access to legal representation for those who wouldn't have had access otherwise. We worked on everything from housing and immigration to voting rights and child advocacy issues. And I saw firsthand that most of the time, our system, our legal system, is not easy to navigate alone by people who are often facing multiple crises and stress. So my moving to Congress was really sort of a change in venue because I'm still working on many of the same issues, just in a new forum. But every day I am seeing that through line between clients and constituents. And I really think it's important that we forge those connections between particularly constituent service representatives who are working in our congressional offices and legal services. This is especially true now as our communities are continuing to suffer the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. And there's an opportunity both to strengthen the relationship between constituent services and client services, and to help our members of Congress and their staffs gain a greater understanding of just how important legal services are. Helping folks stay in their homes, beat opioid addiction, access veterans benefits, get access to all of those great things we've passed through Congress to help our constituents. Often we're going to rely upon legal services either to help individual clients or to help explain it to us and to the general public. And that's where our legal aid partners are so, so important. So that's why I'm proud to be hosting this conversation so we can hear from the experts on the ground about the impact of COVID on their clients, our constituents. And I'm looking forward to hearing how Congress can be more supportive of those efforts going forward. So thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to my co-chair and colleague from Pennsylvania, Representative Fitzpatrick.
Ron, it's good to see you, sir, and Mary Gay, my partner and co-chair. We're very, very excited to be embarking upon this year. It's an issue that her and I care deeply about, and it's great to be with everybody. And you know, this has always been a need, but it's certainly a need during this unprecedented time of economic hardship. Individuals, families, veterans, including veterans in need, especially deserve their equal to justice under the law. And as Mary Gay has talked about a lot, and as she knows from her past experience, civil legal aid is critical to ensuring that federal policy responses aimed at pandemic relief, particularly for low-income Americans, are carried through. And while millions of Americans have been impacted by COVID-19, those struggling with economic uncertainty to begin with have suffered the greatest harm, for sure. And reports of housing evictions across the country have surged. And the LSC has estimated in August that more than 5 million households who qualify for LSC-funded services are at risk of eviction. That's over 5 million. That's an astounding and devastating number. The LSC has been a steadfast defender of the tidal wave of citizens facing eviction via economic hardship in all of our communities. And I especially want to thank them for helping to protect the citizens in my district in Bucks and Montgomery counties. Legal aid works in support of the federal response to COVID-19 so that the intended beneficiaries of federal relief are both aware of and can access the appropriated financial, housing, employment, and health resources that Congress intended. For instance, federal unemployment benefit supplements have greatly mitigated, and I've heard the same stories I'm sure Mary Gay has, mitigated the effects of the economic crisis. However, many people have been excluded because they were not able to access legal help. The same is true of other benefit streams that could cushion COVID's impacts, such as stimulus checks, Social Security, or veterans benefits. Legal aid also helps reduce the burden on our judicial and administrative law courts by focusing and streamlining the issues presented before those courts. Our federal and state court systems have struggled with closures, backlogs, and supplemental costs throughout the pandemic. And effective legal aid programs can help the courts process cases more efficiently while protecting the due process rights of clients and people that need it. So as you will learn more about today during the briefing, supporting Legal Aid and Legal Services Corporation during and in the aftermath of this pandemic is critical in eventually getting our country back to normal. So thank you all for inviting me. I look forward to working with you throughout this congressional cycle. You picked a really good co-chair in Mary Gay. I personal respect for her. I consider her a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and we look forward to helping out in whatever way we can in a very bipartisan manner.
Good afternoon. I'm John Levy. It's my privilege to serve as the 10th chair of the board of directors of the Legal Services Corporation. On behalf of the LSC board, I'm honored to participate in this important hearing on the delivery of civil legal assistance during the pandemic. Thank you to Representatives Scanlon and Fitzpatrick for sponsoring this special event, and more significantly, for enthusiastically taking up the mantle of leadership of the Congressional Access to Legal Aid Caucus. This bipartisan caucus helps shine a light on the crisis in civil legal aid, and each year promotes LSC funding by strongly and effectively encouraging congressional colleagues to sign what you all know is a Dear Colleague letter of support for LSC funding. Last year, the caucus played a vital role in helping LSC secure $50 million in supplemental COVID funding. But we gather here today as we mark the first anniversary of COVID-induced lockdowns, which have left millions of Americans struggling with unemployment, evictions, domestic violence, and other issues. We need to respond to these and other threats that the pandemic has and will present for the civil legal aid community. And our panelists this afternoon will provide perspective from the field. The legal challenges presented by the pandemic are particularly daunting, not because they're new, but because they deepen an already existing emergency. There was a full-blown crisis in civil legal aid well before the pandemic, and there will be an even worse one unless we act. During the past decade, the number of Americans qualifying for LSC-funded civil legal assistance because they were living at 125% of the federal poverty guidelines or below has hovered around the 20% mark. But we know that as a result of the pandemic, that number has surely skyrocketed. LSC's 2017 Justice Gap report concluded during a robust economy that low-income Americans received inadequate or no professional help for 86% of the civil legal problems they face in a given year. And LSC's 2019 survey of its grantees found that 42% of the legal problems presented received no help of any kind because of a lack of resources. So while we're grateful that Congress included $465 million for LSC in the fiscal year 2021 appropriation, it is not nearly enough to meet this unmet need. In fact, it's only half of what in today's dollars would have been the 880 million appropriated just 2 years after LSC's founding in the 70s, when only 12% of a smaller US population qualified for civil legal assistance. The 50 million awarded by Congress to LSC in special funding as a part of the CARES Act was distributed to grantees within 3 weeks of receipt. But that wasn't nearly enough. Last August, LSC conducted an analysis of the cost of providing basic legal representation in just one category, eviction. We estimated that our grantees would need an additional $2.5 billion to meet the increased need. Surging demand for legal services on top of a chronically underfunded civil legal aid system requires a much bolder response. LSC's request for an additional 350 to 500 million in emergency COVID funding was as a part of the recent American Rescue Plan Act, unfortunately was not included as a part of the act. But even before making that request, our board had prepared for fiscal year 2022 a budget request for slightly more than $1 billion. The additional funding that LSC seeks for 2022 is in the overall federal budget a very small number. But we are long overdue in properly investing in seeing to it that our country's low-income population has fair access to our civil justice system. After all, the belief in the fairness of our justice system goes to the very heart of who we are as a people. We cannot put so many individuals and families in a position where they have to navigate the complex civil justice system on their own, on the outside, looking in. Equal access to justice is essential to the rule of law. As Texas Chief Justice and the president of the Conference of Chief Justices, Nathan Hecht, has so eloquently observed, and I quote him, "The justice system must be accessible to all. Justice only for those who can afford it is neither justice for all nor justice at all. The rule of law, so revered in this country, has no integrity if its promises and protections extend only to the well-to-do," unquote. And as the late Justice Antonin Scalia so powerfully put it at LSC's 40th anniversary, and I quote, "The American ideal is not for some justice. It is, as the Pledge of Allegiance says, liberty and justice for all, or as the Supreme Court pediment has it, equal justice for all. I've always thought that somewhat redundant," the justice went on. "Can there be justice if it is not equal? Can there be a just society when some do not have justice? Equality, equal treatment is perhaps the most fundamental element of justice," unquote. At LSC's White House Forum on Access to Justice in 2016, then Vice President Joe Biden called equal access to justice, and I quote him, "the most profound right that makes every other right possible," unquote. Our country now faces threats on many fronts, but none more significant in my view than this. If we are to leave a fair and just society to the generations that will follow, we must rise now to meet this challenge head on. It is time to dramatically increase LSC funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Representative Fitzpatrick. And many thanks to you and Representative Scanlon for giving 3 heroes of the American legal aid community the opportunity to share their stories of how the pandemic has harmed their clients and how they and their colleagues have responded with courage and innovation to help those clients. Colleen Cotter has served as the executive director at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland since 2005. Colleen has served on numerous LSC task forces and committees, including our Justice Gap Advisory Committee, our Data Project Advisory Committee, and our Pro Bono Task Force. Before joining Cleveland Legal Aid, Colleen worked for two other LSC grantees, Indiana Legal Services and Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Maine. Radia Thomas serves as the executive director of Mid-Penn Legal Services, where she has worked since 2003. Radia is the president of the Pennsylvania Project Directors Association and has served as chair of the National Legal Aid and Defender Association Board of Directors. She has served as a member of the Pennsylvania Bar Association House of Delegates and the Pennsylvania Bar Foundation Board as a board member, and finally as a member of the Pennsylvania Bar Association Minority Bar Committee. Our third panelist, Adrienne Worthy, is the executive director of Legal Aid of West Virginia, a position she has held for 20 years. Adrienne is the vice chair of West Virginia's Access to Justice Commission and a current member of the West Virginia State Bar's Legal Services for the Poor Committee. Adrienne recently served on LSC's opioid task force. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Let's get right to it. The pandemic, and most of all, the pandemic's effect on your clients, your neighbors. What kind of changes or increases have you seen in the types of cases affecting your clients? Radia, our hosts here are from Pennsylvania. You're from Pennsylvania. Let's start with you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this. This is very important and I'm pleased to be here. And I'd like to start out by saying, while many areas were affecting our clients, two of the areas that I'd like to point out were unemployment compensation and housing. And when many of the businesses shut down in Pennsylvania because of the shelter-in-place order, it led to really an increased demand for unemployment compensation insurance for many of the newly unemployed Pennsylvanians. However, our system, the pandemic exposed a number of limitations in our system, including the insufficiency to process the many, many applications that were coming through. But also, one of the big areas was the lack of awareness about the pandemic insurance that was in place. Checking it, I ran some statistics, and starting from March 2020 till now, to show that our unemployment compensation work has increased by 260%. So a little over a year. And in the housing area, there was lots of confusion because while there were lots of moratoriums in place, federal, state, and sometimes local, there was lots of confusion. Not only among the tenants, but the landlords, and also among the minor judiciary where all landlord-tenant cases start. This combination of lack of income, coupled with threatened housing loss when people were told to shelter in place, led to overwhelming requests for our services in these two substantive areas. In many cases, the issues of housing and unemployment compensation overlapped. This is illustrated, if I could, by a case of a young woman, a mother of 3 children, who she was working at a personal care home. When the pandemic hit, her employer decreased her hours. She fell behind in her rent, not by a lot, but enough that she was threatened with eviction. It was winter, shelters were full. She and her children had nowhere else to go. Her landlord filed an MDJ complaint to have her evicted. Fortunately for us, she contacted us. And when our advocate was working with her, he discovered that she was eligible for pandemic UC. He helped her to apply for it. She was found eligible, not only to resolve the back payment of rent, but also going forward. So that crisis was averted for her. And she later wrote to her advocate and said, "I'm so glad that you were here. Mid-Penn was here. I was ready to give up on everything." And I too am glad that we were here and able to serve her. But not only her, but we had many of hundreds of others who found themselves in similar situations. And this is just one story that I can tell out of thousands about the efforts, about the effect of job loss and housing insecurity that our clients face that were exacerbated by the pandemic.
Thanks, Radia. I'm glad you were there for that client, and I'm glad you're here with us today. Colleen, what are you seeing in Cleveland?
In Cleveland, we are seeing much the same things that Radia is seeing in Pennsylvania. At every time during the year and pre-pandemic and probably post-pandemic, clients call us about very basic needs where they encounter barriers that legal aid can remove to those basic needs of shelter, safety, economic security. But during the pandemic, as in Pennsylvania and Cleveland, we're seeing a significant increase in requests for assistance with housing and unemployment. And a couple of examples of that, at the beginning of the pandemic, as we were trying to get the word out about the additional unemployment benefits available, we partnered with a local television station. They had us on TV to talk about the new programs and rights of low-wage workers and access to benefits. They did a Facebook Live event, and then they invited people to call their station so that our staff and volunteers who were at the ready could provide information to all of these folks who were really desperate to understand what their rights were and how were they going to provide for their children. So many people called that it absolutely crashed the television station's pretty sophisticated phone system. And we couldn't actually provide that information to those individuals. We had to do it only over television and Facebook Live. That's the desperation that people have felt throughout the pandemic. That was at the beginning, but it continues to this day. We have seen a 47% increase in housing cases and a 610% increase in unemployment cases. It's really overwhelming, and it's confusing, as Radia noted, confusing about what are the courts doing, what are government agencies doing, and the rapid response of Congress has been terrific. Also confusing as new programs arise. So getting that information out to people and helping them navigate the system has been a challenge. As I said, folks call us because they are encountering a barrier to basic needs. And before the pandemic, something bad was happening to them. They were at risk of losing something important. So they were really on the edge when they contacted us. During the pandemic, our clients are not just on the edge, they're clinging to that edge, because without support of unemployment benefits, preventing an eviction, as Radia said, they have nowhere else to go. The need is so great at this time.
Thank you, Colleen. Adrienne, tell us what's going on in West Virginia.
Well, similar to Ohio and Pennsylvania, we have seen increases in requests for help around unemployment, as well as benefit cases related to food security and health care, and now housing cases. Calls from clients have been coming back, and they're growing in volume every day, which is a good thing. Because during the pandemic, as you think about how chaotic our lives were, those early days of chaos, we saw how that chaos played out for people with a basic lack of resources. It led to broken connections in the community where our clients would typically go for community engagement. They weren't going to the schools, they weren't going to local nonprofits or to the churches or to government agencies or child care centers, the doctors, the shelters, or legal aid. And community-based legal aids, like all of us are, depend on those community partnerships and community connections to facilitate referrals. And in the early days, some of those contacts were down. Now, again, as I've noted and my two colleagues have noted, that is no longer true. And in fact, we're worried about the opposite, that the need will overwhelm our current resources. One of the other things that I would quickly note is that even in the best of times, one of the key roles that legal aid plays is helping clients navigate a legal system that can be confusing and overwhelming. And I think, as we all know, the past 365 days have not been the best of times. Now, my program, Legal Aid of West Virginia, is a statewide program, which means that we serve all of West Virginia's 55 counties. And as my colleagues have noted, as the courts have reopened, they've done so in different ways, sometimes different ways within the same county, different ways between neighboring counties. And what that means is that clients are overwhelmed more so than in normal times. I feel like what we've seen across the board, despite the best efforts of many, and people have really tried, particularly in our judicial system, but we are seeing that the systems are really challenging the reality of access to justice, especially for people with limited transportation, no internet, and basic life stability problems.
Thank you, Adrian. I just want to underscore a point that Radia, Colleen, and Adrian all made, and it's really critical, particularly in light of the $1.9 trillion package that Congress just passed. The provisions of those sorts of legislative packages are not self-executing. The moratorium on evictions isn't a magic cloak that keeps people from being evicted. You generally across the country, you have to assert defenses. You have to be aware of those defenses and know how to assert them, know how to certify the various factors that the moratorium require tenants to certify. The benefits, the financial benefits, the unemployment and other financial assistance out of these sorts of legislation don't just magically appear on your doorstep. You have to apply for those benefits, and you have to know that they exist and know what the qualifications are. And legal aid plays a critical role in seeing that the intended beneficiaries of that sort of assistance actually get it. Well, the work that all three of our programs on the panel today do does not take place in a vacuum. While the clients living in poverty throughout the country, and particularly in Cleveland and in Harrisburg and in West Virginia, have faced many challenges over the last year. The folks who are trying to deliver them services have likewise face challenges in trying to provide that help. So my question to the panel is, how has the pandemic impacted your services and your staff in your ability to serve your clients? And how did you pivot to work remotely at the start of the pandemic? Radia, why don't we start with you again?
Thank you again. And as Adrian was, her program is a statewide program. Our program is not a statewide program. It is a 18 county program made up of areas of rural, urban, and suburban, which makes it very interesting. But anyway, COVID-19 forced us, like all of us, all three of us, and every other director and of a legal aid program across the nation, to make some very challenging decisions very, very quickly. And at the forefront, I think for all of us, was how are we going to continue to get services to clients, because we knew that our clients were going to need us now more than ever. We were questions like, where are survivors in need of legal protection going to get that protection if we're not there? In this time of great job loss, where were folks needing unemployment compensation going to get representation if they were denied, or even to get an understanding about the various programs? As well as, even despite the moratoria, as you were just talking about, Ron, where would they go if they didn't understand what it meant, or if they were facing evictions? So as I was thinking about the past year, some of the words that came to mind that sort of guided us were resiliency, nimbleness, and creativity. And those were the things that we had to do. And that's how we worked to implement our transition to remote work, starting back in March of 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago, but it really was only a little over a year ago now. And we knew that we had to transition very quickly because we knew that these issues already existed and they would be exacerbated by this pandemic. However, technology was going to be a great need. I just explained that our program is rural, it's urban, and it's suburban. Technology was going to be a problem. Many of our staff live in those rural areas without access to broadband. So not only was this great technological divide going to be a problem for our clients, it was going to be for our staff and our ability to continue to serve our clients across the region. So with that being said, we were so very, very grateful to receive the LSC telework grant that we utilized, which allows us to invest in much needed technology so that all of our staff, particularly those in our rural areas, could continue to serve our clients. They could access our systems remotely. They could do intakes, take calls, and our advocates could continue to represent clients across the various tribunals. Without that extra equipment that we would have needed, services across our area would have been very, very uneven. And we're here to serve people across this 18 county region, and we did not want that. So with the needed equipment that we got from our staff, got through the technology grant from LSC, our staff was able to quickly adjust. They started serving clients. Of course, we were working from home because our offices had to close until we were told it was safe to do so under our phased-in plan here in Pennsylvania. And while they recognized that it wasn't ideal, we were still able to serve people. And it allowed them to continue to address the many issues that our clients were facing: domestic violence, landlord-tenant issues, unemployment compensation, other benefits issues. They learned to work the new technologies, different court procedures across the 18 jurisdictions that we have, different virtual platforms, and while handling the increased number of individuals needing access to our services. And then we also worked with community partners, as Colleen and Adrian did, to get the word out that while our offices were closed, we were still here serving clients. And that was the message we needed to get across. And we did, so that people could get to us. And I think our clients quickly adapted. They understood that while the offices were closed, they could still get to us if they had a legal problem that they needed help with.
Thank you, Radia.
Thank you.
Colleen, could you quickly tell us how is the pandemic affecting your staff and services?
Very similar to Rodia's experience. I want to just start by noting the incredible resilience of the staff who work at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. They have been incredible. It's been a very stressful time for everybody across the country, across the world. And the fact that our staff every day gets up and is dedicated to serving the needs of our clients is commendable. And they've been able to do that because we have been able to put into place the technology to enable them to stay safely at home and continue to serve clients. We had a really strong foundation of that technology to start with, due in large part to the very consistent funding from the Legal Services Corporation. You can't just overnight all of a sudden have all that technology. Like Rodia, we added a lot with additional funds from the Legal Services Corporation, but we had to have that foundation on which to build in order to quickly add what we needed and move on from there. Our goal was to continue to maintain maximum capacity to serve client needs while protecting both our staff and our client community from the spread of the pandemic. We wanted to make sure that we were not a super spreader, and we have been able to avoid that role throughout the pandemic and continue to serve clients. In addition to the LSC additional dollars, we've also been able to take advantage of funds available from the Paycheck Protection Program and the CARES Act to maintain that programming and in fact increase our staffing and our services during this year. And then the last thing, that we had that strong foundation, so we were able to pivot in different ways, but having a strong communications plan and capacity strong partnerships with other organizations, and multiple ways of reaching and connecting with our client community, from Facebook to Twitter to mailings, to partnering with television shows and radio shows, has been really important to be connected with and present with our clients, even as we have not been physically present with our clients. The last thing that we've had to do is try to help our clients overcome the barriers that they have with regard to technology. Many of our courts are virtual. Engaging in a virtual hearing is impossible if you don't have the technology to do that. So we have purchased some tablets with internet access, and we're loaning those out to our clients so that they can participate in virtual hearings with their advocate and prevent their eviction. So being creative and, again, resilient has been critical to our ability to continue to serve.
Thanks, Colleen. Adrian, how have you been affected in West Virginia?
Well, just very quickly, Ron, I would note that tomorrow is 1 year ago since we began in remote pandemic mode. And I am proud that we were able to pivot very quickly. We paused for 2 days so that we could ramp up all the technology and get everybody aligned so they could work remotely. And like my colleagues, I cannot say enough about the staff at Legal Aid of West Virginia in terms of their flexibility, creativity, and just being really mission focused. The only other thing I would note is that we deliver services in a variety of settings, working out of schools, mental health facilities, nursing homes, and with many partners in the community. And one of the challenges has been to adapt to government protocols that relate to those specific settings. And again, I feel like our staff have really pushed forward in that being creative and figuring out ways to let people know we're here and help them access our services.
Thanks, Adrian. Colleen, let's go back to you. Low-income households in Cleveland, as in other places, face potentially devastating evictions during the pandemic. The city of Cleveland has undertaken significant initiatives over the last year regarding housing and evictions. Cleveland had an eviction moratorium from March through June 15th, and the Cleveland City Council also made effective last July the right to counsel in eviction cases. Could you talk to us in more detail about the impacts of those initiatives, how they've affected clients, and what you're seeing in the area of evictions as the pandemic continues?
Well, as I indicated earlier, we've seen a significant increase in clients who are in need of representation in evictions. And the timing on this could not have been better. Cleveland City Council passed legislation establishing a right to counsel in evictions in Cleveland, as you said, effective July of last year. And so that means that any family in Cleveland who faces an eviction, who lives in poverty, has a right to a lawyer, and that lawyer is a legal aid lawyer. So before the pandemic, we were on our path to implementing this program. It's a partnership between Legal Aid and the United Way of Greater Cleveland. And then when the pandemic hit, we knew that the services we would provide would be that much more critical. Before this law became effective, only 1% of tenants had a lawyer with them in facing an eviction. 1%. Having a right to counsel, and we're the fourth city in the country to establish a right to counsel. Having a right to counsel turns everything upside down. It changes the outcome of evictions, and it also changes how we think about evictions. It changes our justice system. The idea that we deprive people of their home without a lawyer is no longer okay in the city of Cleveland. So we were able, in spite of the sort of shock of everything shutting down at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able to keep moving forward and implement this new program. And we started representation on July 1st. So every tenant comes to us and they get represented. We have engaged an evaluator because we really want to understand the effect of this program going forward. And in the first 6 months from July to December, the first report came out showing that 93% of evictions were prevented. 93%. And for those cases where tenants did have to move, we were able to get additional time for them to move in 83% of those cases. And that additional time can be life-saving because people don't lose their things aren't out on the tree lawn. We know from the Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, that people, when they get evicted, usually move to substandard housing. It starts a whole downward spiral. And by having additional time to move, it can prevent that downward spiral. Now, we have bigger goals for this. We believe that with a right to counsel in evictions, not only will houses be saved, but housing conditions will improve because we're there to chat, to bring counterclaims when there are conditions, lead paint issues, heat that doesn't work. We also believe that neighborhoods will be more stable as people can put down roots and stay in their neighborhoods, that people will be able to keep their jobs and get better jobs because they know I can take this bus to get to work. And if I don't know where I'm staying tomorrow, how do I know how to get to work? The disruption that evictions will have to jobs will be removed, and children will stay in school instead of having to move around. So it will increase the value of education and augment the investment that communities are making in education. So what we're learning so far is that the right to counsel has kept people in their homes and has given hope to a whole community that in fact their rights will not be trampled, that they will, as you said, Ron, rights are not self-effectualizing. You have to raise those rights. And I just want to end by telling you one story of a client who came to us, a man who had lost his job and had gotten behind in rent. He has 5 children. He's a single parent, and his kids had been in foster care, and they had been returned to him. He had a gunshot wound. So he had a lot of issues in his past, and he was moving forward and taking his family forward. But because of the pandemic, he stumbled, and his landlord sued for eviction, and legal aid shows up. The landlord was frustrated at first because, oh my gosh, now the tenant is going to drag things out and I want this person out. But we were able to help our tenant access rental assistance that an appropriation from Congress made available, and that goes directly to landlords. We were able to negotiate a settlement of that case. Our client has found a job and can maintain that rent. And at the end of the day, when this case was settled, I got an email from the landlord saying, thank you. I really didn't like this, that the tenant had a lawyer and I didn't. This was an unrepresented landlord. But in the end, your great representation of the tenant actually benefited me because the system worked as it was supposed to. And that's our hope for all tenants and most landlords with right to counsel in Cleveland.
Thanks, Colleen. That's a great story. And that 93% eviction avoided statistic is really eye-catching. Adrian, people in West Virginia have been severely impacted by the opioid epidemic even before the pandemic. Could you tell us about the kinds of cases you've seen as a result of opioid use disorder, and how has the pandemic impacted individuals and families affected by opioid use disorder and services for those families?
Well, first, let me answer by talking about the pandemic's impact on those affected by substance use disorder and their families, and then our casework. Many of you may be aware that while the pandemic has replaced the drug epidemic in the headlines, drug overdoses and the negative impacts on those in recovery and their families has actually accelerated over the past year. In preparation for today, I was looking at some CDC statistics, and they noted that there were more overdose deaths in the United States in the 12 months that ended in May of last year, May of 2020. That's the highest ever recorded 12-month period. And so in at least 40 states, they are showing that the opioid death rate has increased significantly in that year timeframe, 2019 to 2020. I was looking at the stats related to Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and DC. West Virginia's jump in overdose rates was 22%, Ohio's 13%, Pennsylvania's 11%, and they're in the district in a stunning 60% in that time frame. And those numbers only capture the beginning of the pandemic. So I don't think we're going to be surprised when there are some really startling numbers that come out when more data becomes available as we track our way through 2020. I work out of Charleston, West Virginia, which is our state capital and also our largest city. And I just happened to be in a forum yesterday where our city police chief, Chief Hunt, was participating. And as part of that forum, he noted that he said, if COVID hadn't happened, the opioid crisis would be our city's #1 health issue. And I think that that is not only true here in Charleston, the state, but again, I think the numbers are trending, unfortunately, that will be true throughout the country. So with those numbers in mind, in the latter half of 2020, we began to see an increase in need in 2 areas. One is for individuals in recovery from substance use disorder, and the second is related to kinship families, grandparents or other relatives who are raising children, often because of drug use by the parent or the death of the children's parents. So first, with regard to individuals with SUD, you have to think about that the same pandemic stressors that impacted all of us or those in poverty in West Virginia are present. Losing someone's job, losing your health insurance, food insecurity, isolation, mental health triggers. But these stressors are magnified when someone is struggling with addiction, and in many instances can overwhelm a successful recovery. So in addition to that, where you've got all these stressors, you also have broken community connections, as I described earlier, where you may have treatment programs that services have been interrupted because of the pandemic, or you may have face-to-face supports that individuals with SUD had been working with pretty successfully, going remote, and people struggling with that. Now, our important work in recovery has continued throughout the pandemic, and part of it comes through a medical legal partnership where we have one of our lawyers embedded in a recovery health setting, working on the civil legal needs of patients who are involved in that clinic. And we continue to help people in all kinds of ways, help them get their driver's license, help them expunge criminal records so that they can find a job, working with domestic violence survivors, working with parents in recovery, fighting housing and workplace discrimination, all the kinds of issues that individuals in recovery struggle with. Now, I've got a quick story that I love. A lawyer on our staff was recently interviewed for our newsletter that we send out to lawyers and others in the justice community. And he relayed his work with a single dad who was in recovery and was using Uber to commute to work in a rural area because he didn't have a driver's license. So our lawyer worked with him first to get his driver's license back, and then our client was able to save up money to buy a car. And the lawyer in this interview described so powerfully, I loved what he said. He said, I had someone call me crying because he got his license back. You'd think it was the happiest day of his life, just getting a piece of plastic that we all take for granted. After living in rural West Virginia and being deprived of one so long, he probably felt like he had wings. And I mean, that's changing lives. The second group that we work with is kinship families, grandparents who, again, are raising or other relatives who are working in drug impacted families. And again, for them, the pandemic has been very, very tough for many of the same reasons we've all experienced. Schools have been canceled, sports have been canceled, childcare has been almost non-existent, social supports and services have been difficult to access. income is tight. And I think for this group, one of the really big fears is this tends to be an older population. These are the folks that were really at great risk of getting COVID and had fear of illness and death, and who would be caring for these children in their care. This is not a group that reaches out easily for support. And we rely very heavily on partnerships to get referrals so that we can provide legal assistance for guardianships or adoptions, or helping these families access health care or housing or income benefits. And as you might expect, many of the programs in rural areas had a difficult time pivoting and continuing to stay in touch with their clients and do referrals. So we've continued to work at outreach and in partnership and on our own, and that caseload is building back. And I would just note in summary, the need to provide legal assistance to individuals and families impacted by drugs is as great as it's ever been. And we hope that as communities reopen and that as dollars from various rescue packages flow to communities, we want to be able to ramp up legal services to both client bases and to provide much needed stability and also hope.
Thanks, Adrienne. Radia, Adrienne touched on a couple of these issues, but MidPenn likewise covers 18 counties across central Pennsylvania. And like Adrienne's program includes both rural and urban areas. Can you talk about the obstacles you faced in providing services in such a diverse geographic region, and what specific barriers do you see in rural versus urban settings, and how has the pandemic affected those barriers or created new barriers?
Many of the things that Adrienne mentioned, we also see in our rural areas. One of the things that I would like to emphasize, though, is what I call the lack of social services infrastructure. In the more urbanized areas, of course, we have, human services councils and this and that and this service and that service. In some of our more rural areas, we don't have that. And so there's hard to forge those partnerships. And where you do have this in those rural areas, we have the smaller sort of social services agencies, they completely shut down. So we weren't able to have those connections, and our clients weren't able to have those connections. And where there's also, and I think Adrienne mentioned this as well, there's lack of public transportation. You really do need a car to get around. In many of those areas, there's no homeless shelters, there's no food banks where you could go. They have to come into one of the cities around to get food or other needed services or other things that they might need. Even in our domestic violence, even though there's a shelter in many of the counties, there isn't in some of the rural counties. If someone's in a domestic violence situation, they often have to travel to a neighboring county for shelter. So those are some of the things that we faced in those areas. And in the more urbanized areas, there was a vibrant social services network that remained open for the most part, that we were able to connect with to get the word out. In our more rural areas, that was not the case. So what we needed to do was rely on the technology to get it out through things such as our Facebook and Live and other things that we did, presentations, connecting with other services, public access television, those kinds of things, to let people know that we were still here. It required a lot of different outreach, sending out, as Colleen mentioned, flyers to people directly. In several of our areas, there are law schools, and they were open, and law school clinics were open for the most part. I mean, on a very, very limited scale, getting it out to say MidPenn is still open. Please if you come across clients that need our services, refer them to us. We also did a lot. We also did something when the emergency shelter assistance money became available. We hired some law school students who had lost their jobs over the summer that they were going to have over the summer, and hired them to as what we called navigators to help our clients who needed to be able to access the emergency shelter money through our Pennsylvania Housing Finance Organization, because it was a little bit complex, to help them to navigate that so that they could become eligible for it, so that they could keep their apartments or housing or whatever living situation that they were in. Because we knew that we wanted to keep our attorney resources and advocate resources for the actual litigation piece, but we could use these folks to help us out, to help clients to get the money piece that they needed to maintain their housing. So, and then a lot of connection with the bar associations. We did a lot of work with them for virtual events and getting the word out to various client constituents across the various areas, particularly in the Hispanic community and everything like that. So that's kind of how we had to work, and that's how we're continuing to work. Things are opening up a little bit each day, but we plan to continue. And even post-pandemic, we've talked internally, and I'm sure Colleen and Adrian have too, that some of this stuff works so well, we want to keep it moving because it really allows us to reach many, many more people.
Thanks, Radia. And thank you to Colleen and Adrian as well for sharing the experiences and challenges of your clients. More importantly, thanks to all three of you and your colleagues for your heroic work as first responders at this critical moment in history in helping low-income neighbors in your communities survive the pandemic. And I want to profoundly thank Representatives Scanlon and Fitzpatrick for giving Adrian, Colleen, and Radia the opportunity to share their stories and their insights today. And I want to thank Representatives Fitzpatrick and Scanlon for their leadership of the Congressional Access to Legal Aid Caucus. The need for your leadership at this moment could not be greater. Before the pandemic, just 14% of the civil legal problems confronting low-income Americans received adequate legal assistance. During the pandemic and after, this number will surely dwindle unless we substantially increase civil legal aid funding. LSC's appropriation in 1994 was $400 million. Today, 27 years later, and even after 5 consecutive years of appropriation increases, LSC's appropriation stands at just $465 million. To state the obvious, funding for civil legal aid has not kept up with increases in civil legal needs before the pandemic, much less during or after it. Enormous numbers of Americans living in poverty will face critical, life-impacting civil legal problems with inadequate or no assistance unless funding for LSC is substantially increased. LSC's bipartisan board, and you heard from our board chair, John Levy, has recognized these circumstances in requesting a FY 2022 appropriation of just over $1 billion. We look forward to sharing that budget with Congress in the coming weeks. Again, thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. Stay well.